Hello and welcome to the final lab, the cranial nerve and brainstem lab. Most of the lab is going to take place using this model, and you will be learning the names of the different cranial nerves, where they reside, and as well as their functions. And then go over some of the clinical tests that we use in the clinic to test the function of these cranial nerves. I'll kind of highlight a couple of them towards the end of the discussion here, but these tests are in your lab manual. Some of them you can even do at home, and I highly advise that you go through them for your own knowledge, but also for the purposes of the lab quiz as well as the lab practicum. So you'll notice that the first handful of slides are really focusing in on this model. The image that you will get for the lab quiz or the lab practicum are going to be on this model, and specifically the images that you see in the lab manual. So they might, remove some of the different names, and then they'll ask you, essentially what is this cranial nerve and what is its function, or they might just ask the function, or which cranial nerves are involved in, eye movement, and you would need to be able to identify all of them. Things like that will be tested on the lab quiz and the lab practicum. So just getting right to it, I'm going to go a little fast through the cranial nerves because there is a lot of stuff to cover on this brainstem model. All of this is in your lab manual, so if I'm going a little bit too fast for you, please consult the lab manual. It's all there, and you can go through it at your leisure. So starting, the first one that you can see on this brainstem model is actually cranial nerve number 2. This is the optic nerve. Essentially, you can kind of see where the optic nerve kind of came out of this model. Kind of looks like alien antennas here. This would actually continue out to the eyeball, because essentially these are all the axons that are coming out of the retina through the optic disc and coming to the optic chiasm, where they cross over to the lateral geniculate nuclei on either side. Essentially this would be the optic tract then. So this structure, as you remember, is the optic chiasm. The optic chiasm gets its name from the Greek symbol chi, which looks like an X, meaning that the information crosses over. Next up, we have cranial nerve number 3, and that is oculomotor. And so you can kind of see it, this guy right here. What's really interesting is that you'll notice, if you've gotten to the brainstem sections of the actual lectures, if you look at the cross sections for the midbrain, you'll actually see the fibers that are going to make the oculomotor nerve. And that's because the nuclei essentially reside in the midbrain. And so they're kind of coming together to essentially form the oculomotor nerve. The oculomotor nerve, as its name suggests, is just involved in eye movement, along with a couple of other cranial nerves. One of which is cranial nerve number 4. That's this guy kind of peeking out from either side. That is trochlear. And trochlear is also involved in eye movement. So again, this is a motor cranial nerve. Just below that is the most recognizable cranial nerve, which is cranial nerve number 5, or the trigeminal nerve. So that's this guy right here. On these brainstem models, you really can't see how large the trigeminal is, and it actually branches into 3 branches, which you can kind of see on some diagrams, including the ones that are in your lab manual. The trigeminal nerve is going to be bringing in sensory information from the face, as well as motor information going to the jaw to control mastication or chewing. Next up is cranial nerve number 6, which is right here. This is known as abducens. Abducens is going to also be involved in eye movement. So there are 3 so far that we talked about that are involved in eye movement. That would be cranial nerve number 3, or oculomotor, up here, cranial nerve number 4, or trochlear, right here, and then now abducens, cranial nerve number 6. If you start to go a little bit lateral, you will start to see cranial nerve number 7. This is the facial nerve. This nerve is going to bring sensory information to the central nervous system from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, so a lot of taste, as well as projecting motor information to the face to control facial expressions such as smiling. There's actually a case that we had in the neurosurgery clinic not too long ago of an individual who had blunt force trauma to the head, and swelling actually pinched his facial nerve on one side, and he actually had essentially drooping on one side of his face. A little bit lateral to that is the vestibulocochlear nerve, which involves a lot of the stuff that I study with the vestibular system. This is a purely sensory nerve, and it's going to essentially take information about essentially auditory information as well as balance, your vestibular sense, and bring it into the central nervous system to the brainstem. This is really important for balance because there's actually the vestibular nuclei relay a lot of information to the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncles. If we were to go just a little bit below that, this guy right here is glossopharyngeal, or cranial nerve 9. Glossopharyngeal is essentially involved in motor information being sent to the throat, so controlling essentially swallowing, as well as some sensory information coming in from that region. This nerve right below it, cranial nerve number 10, is perhaps one of the most important nerves in your body. I guess you could argue that for most of these. If you lost any of those, you'd have serious deficits. But this one particularly gets a lot of interest because it's the vagus nerve. It controls your viscera, both sensory and motor information, and it's really, really important. Next up, this guy that comes off on the sides. Let me try and hold this a little bit better so you can see it. This is cranial nerve number 11, or also known as the accessory nerve or spinal accessory. This is essentially going to control the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscles that essentially are involved in shoulder shrugs. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about some of the cranial nerve tests. And then these guys that come out the front are the cranial nerve 12, or the hypoglossal nerve. So that actually controls the motor information that's controlling your tongue. So if you notice, as we've gone through all of these cranial nerves, they are kind of ordered from essentially the top to bottom in the essentially by number, right? So we had cranial nerve number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then 12 is kind of on the front. That's the odd man out. So you'll notice that I mentioned cranial nerves on here 2 through 12, and I didn't mention cranial nerve number 1, which is the olfactory nerve. And the reason you can't see it on this brainstem model is because it doesn't come out of the brainstem. So I'm going to swap over to this guy over here. So cranial nerve number 1, or the olfactory nerve, comes out of the olfactory bulbs. So here you can see the olfactory bulbs that we learned about a little bit during week 1 when we saw the brainstem model, or the brain model, as well as the actual sheep brains that we dissected. You can see the olfactory bulbs here. So the olfactory nerve actually comes out of the olfactory bulbs into the nasal cavity, which is why you don't see it on this model that's brainstem. So if you get the brainstem model that's on the actual exam, like the practicum or a quiz, note that you're not going to see cranial nerve number 1. Okay, so going back to the brainstem model, we also have the dorsal surface. So again, remember, I could ask you on like the quiz or the practicum, which side of the brainstem are you looking at? And so the answer here would be the dorsal surface, and this would be the ventral surface. On the dorsal surface, we can see some structure. Some of this is review that you saw in previous dissections. So you can see the pineal gland, the tectum. Again, you can see the superior and inferior colliculi. Notice that on this brainstem model, it's only on one side. That's because they've kind of cut away part of the brainstem so you can see the nuclei, which we won't really go through in detail in this class. And then down here where the cerebellum was, you can see the cerebellar peduncles, right? So here, this is the middle cerebellar peduncle that's going to come from the pons into the cerebellum. This top portion is the superior cerebellar peduncle, which contains essentially a lot of those fibers that are leaving the cerebellum going to the cortex. And then here would be the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And again, this is all in your lab manual, and you can quiz yourself on the dorsal as well as the ventral surfaces of the brainstem. So what I highly recommend in terms of studying the cranial nerves and this brainstem model is to just print out the blanks that are given to you in the lab manual and either put them in like a sleeve where you can take a dry erase marker and write on them, or just load them up in your iPad or a Surface tablet and just mark the different structures and go through it and then erase it and do it over and over again. And that will really get the knowledge drilled into your brain so that when it comes around for test day, you know them front and back. So the next couple of slides in the lab manual are essentially just giving you a summary of the cranial nerves and the stuff that I basically mentioned here. So just use that to test your knowledge. Also, there's a nice diagram that kind of shows the cranial nerves on a schematic of the brain, just looking at it from the bottom. That's also a good way to kind of test your knowledge of the cranial nerves. And you might see that exact same image on a lab quiz or on the lab practicum, so make sure that you know it. So at this point, I would like to just go over a few of the clinical tests that are in your lab manual. You can go through them at your leisure. You do need to know the individual tests and what they're testing and essentially how they work. I'm just going to briefly go through an overview here. with some of the stuff that we would normally use in the lab to kind of show you how some of these clinical tests are actually administered. So the first one is the swinging flashlight test. So essentially what happens is you take a flashlight and you move it into your eye, and then you see how the pupils constrict in response to moving light into someone's eye. And you might not be able to see it a little bit because of the lights here, but essentially you should see both pupils constrict. If the opposite pupil actually dilates, then that could indicate a problem with either the oculomotor nerve, which carries this information, or the optic nerve, which carries the sensory information from the eye, essentially to the thalamus. The next tests essentially the cranial nerves that are involved in eye movement. So that would be oculomotor, cranial nerve number 3, trochlear, cranial nerve number 4, and abducens, cranial nerve number 6. Often you see this in a clinical test. A physician will ask you to follow their finger and they'll move it in kind of like an H shape, and they're just looking to see whether your eye is adequately able to follow their moving finger. If it doesn't, then that means that perhaps there's a problem with the cranial nerves that are controlling eye movement, or an issue with those muscles. For the hypoglossal nerve, often to test this, and just make you stick out your tongue, just like that. If your hypoglossal nerve is damaged on one side, even if you are trying to move your tongue straight out, you will have deficits in doing so. So it may deviate to one side. The side that it deviates to is usually the side of the lesion, because essentially it's being pulled to that one side. Cranial nerve number 8 is often tested. You can test it with the vestibular sense, and there's a test for that actually in the lab manual, but often it's tested for auditory function. So one of the ways that we do that in the clinic is through something like the Rhine test. So the Rhine test basically takes a 512 hertz tuning fork, and so you can hear it. So essentially what you do is you would do that, or you would tap it on a desk. I don't want to do that now because it's very loud. And then you would hold it up to the patient's ear. Then you would do the test again, where you would do it, and then you would put it essentially on, hold it up against the bone of their skull. If they hear the bone conduction, which is putting it against the skull, louder than the air conduction, which is just holding it up to the ear, that would indicate that there is a problem essentially with the ossicles, or something that is conveying that sound information or those pressure waves into the endolymph fluid that's actually in the inner ear. Another test for auditory is the Weber test. So instead of using a 512 hertz tuning fork, they use a 256 tuning fork. So let me turn this one. And essentially in this test, what you do, you put it directly on the top of the head, and you should hear it the same in both ears. If you don't, that indicates that there may be a problem with audition. If it's louder in one ear, it could be that ear actually has conduction deafness. So you have something with the ossicles maybe that makes it louder because you're not hearing essentially noise coming from the environment. It's also possible that if you had sensory neural loss, you would essentially hear it less on one side, because essentially the information can't be conveyed from the inner ear essentially to the brain. So it's a good way to kind of help identify what sorts of problems may be happening with either the nerve or the pathway. So the vestibular test, which is also in your lab manual, usually comprised of someone walking a straight line, testing their gait. The vestibular portion of the vestibulocochlear nerve, or cranial nerve 8, is essentially conveying information about where you are in space. So it's relaying balance information from the inner ear about how your head is positioned as you're moving to the brain, and so that helps you kind of balance yourself when you're walking a straight line. If there is a problem, you can't balance properly, and you may have issues with gait. Testing cranial nerve number 5 is pretty simple. Essentially, you can test for sensory information coming from the face. You can do 2-point discrimination, kind of like we talked about in a previous lab, or you can just test it by putting something more crudely, like a brush on someone's face, and testing whether there are any sensory deficits. Testing cranial nerve number 11, the accessory nerve, is essentially testing your shoulder muscles. And so in the clinic, you would ask someone to shrug their shoulders upwards. And it should be pretty much the same. It should be symmetrical on both sides. If it's not, then that may indicate that there is an issue with the accessory nerve. Olfaction is relatively easy. You can essentially test your sense of smell with, anything like peppermint or lavender, scented candles, anything that you have around the house, to just test whether olfaction may be impaired. And then cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve, is often tested and along with eyesight using something like a Snellen chart, which is what we have back here. And so the way a Snellen chart works, if you've never seen it, you're essentially reading off a different line of essentially letters, and they basically see how much you can discern fine details by reading the letters down the lines. If you've ever heard like 20/20 vision or 20/40 vision, you've asked yourself, I don't really know what that means. 20/20 just means that you're able to discern the same amount of details that someone with perfect vision can see at 20 feet. If you have 20/40 vision, that means that the details you can see at 20 feet, a person with perfect vision can see at 40 feet. So essentially the 20/40, 20/60, the higher that second number gets, the worse your vision is. And then lastly, we have cranial nerve number 7, which is the facial nerve, which is essentially relaying sensory information from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, as well as conveying motor information to the face for facial expressions. One way that you can test this really easy at home, is to just make something like a sweet solution, so sugar water, or a saline solution or something like salt water, and then putting it into a cup, and then asking one of your parents or roommates or some other poor sap to test these, and if you give them the salt solution, then yeah. Anyways, that's pretty much all of the tests. You can go through them at your leisure in the lab manual. Some of them you can probably do at home, including like the swinging flashlight test. Or if you happen to have tuning forks, you can do like the Ryan test or the Weber test. I hope this lab was informative and helpful to you. If anything is confusing at any point in time, do not hesitate to reach out either on CCLE or through email or in office hours. We'd love to help you. Thanks for watching.